Now that we've looked separately at demand and the demand function and supply and the supply function, let's now bring these two elements together to look at the market for a particular good. As we've already seen, demand slopes downward from left to right, and supply upwards from left to right. Bringing the two together gives us our equilibrium price and quantity in the marketplace. The intersection of supply and demand is consistent with the desires of both suppliers and consumers, and hence gives us our equilibrium price and quantity at P star Q star, the intersection of demand and supply. Now note firstly why that is the case. If price was to be above that equilibrium price, anywhere above, then we'd have excess supply over demand. More would be supplied than consumers actually wish to purchase. As a result, stocks would build up, and producers, as a result, would be inclined to actually manufacture less of the good. Producing less of the good implies a contraction of supply back down the supply curve until we reached the equilibrium price and quantity. Similarly, what if we had a situation where price started off lower than the equilibrium price? Here we'd have a situation of excess demand over supply. We'd have a shortage of the particular good, which may result in some sort of queuing. It would therefore pay producers to actually expand output, to expand supply, and at the same time increase price. So in this case, we'd expect an expansion of supply back up to that market clearing level. It's only at that point, P star Q star, that the desires of both producers and consumers are actually fulfilled. What about changes in some of the other factors which can affect our demand curve? Well, let's say here that we have a normal good and income increases. As we've already seen, that involves a shift of the demand curve to the right. What happens is we move from our initial equilibrium point to a new equilibrium point, a new market clearing price and quantity. And as you can see on our example here, when we have an increase in demand, we move to a new market clearing situation which involves a higher price and a larger quantity traded. So both price and quantity increase when we have an increase in demand. Similarly, we have the decrease in demand, a shift of the demand curve to the left. We end up with a lower price and a lower quantity. What about a situation where it is supply that changes? Let's look now at an increase in supply, perhaps because of a positive change in technology. Our shift of our supply curve to the right moves us to a new market clearing situation, which involves again a higher quantity, but now a lower price. Similarly, if we had a decrease in supply, a shift of the supply curve to the left, we would move to a lower quantity and a higher price. Now, having set up the market framework here by putting supply and demand together, let's look at some particular situations which this analysis can be used to address. Firstly, let's look at a situation where we have some sort of maximum price legislation, a law which sets a maximum price for our good in question. Now here we have our supply curve sloping upwards, our demand curve sloping upwards, which would potentially give us an equilibrium price at the intersection and an equilibrium quantity. The government imposes a maximum price for this good, which is actually lower than that market clearing price. What we effectively have as a result is excess demand over supply. Consumers demand more of the product in question than suppliers are willing to produce. And this effectively gives us a shortage of the good. Now the market cannot react to that excess demand situation by increasing price because of the government legislation. Effectively, the market can no longer allocate the good. So some other form of allocation has to be found. We could have a first come, first serve basis, or perhaps if we talk about a shop situation, regulars only. Effectively, these are both queuing situations. Or we could have a situation where the government determines the allocation of the good in question. And here we would have a situation of rationing. In addition, we could have, and indeed it has been seen in practice, a black market developing. Since some consumers are willing to pay a lot more than the regulated price for the good, and indeed some, as you can see by the demand curve, are willing to pay more than the market clearing price, it is possible that a black market would develop to satisfy those individuals on the upper portion of the demand curve. Now, the other situation which we can use this market framework to look at is the imposition of some sort of goods tax. Here what we are talking about is a tax on each unit of the good actually sold. Now, presumably, producers want to obtain the same price as previously for the number of units that they actually sell. So what we have in this situation is a shift of the supply curve upwards by the amount of the goods tax in question per unit of the good. So if, in our example, initially the producer wanted a price of 1 unit here at the beginning of our supply curve, and the government imposed a 1 unit price of tax on that good, then to get the same amount of revenue at that point, the producer would charge 2 units for the good in question, and so on along that supply curve. So we have a shift in the supply curve upwards. As you can see here, when that happens, we effectively get a new market clearing equilibrium involving a higher price than initially and a lower quantity than initially. But note also that the supplier actually receives a lower price than he would at the previous market clearing level. And the difference between those two will go as tax revenue to the government. As you can hopefully also see, both producers and consumers pay some of that tax. Consumers in the sense that they pay a higher price than previously, producers in the sense that they receive a lower price than previously. But an interesting question might be, who actually pays the most? And the answer to this depends upon the elasticity of demand. So consider again our two extreme possibilities for own price elasticity of demand. So consider first our completely inelastic demand curve. Remember, no change or a change in price has no effect on quantity demanded with our perfectly inelastic demand curve. So if the government imposes a goods tax in this situation, and as a result the supply curve shifts upwards, then the quantity traded, the new equilibrium, remains the same, and the only thing that has changed is the price that the good is traded at. The producer initially traded at a quantity of roughly 80 and a price of slightly over 3. Then the tax is introduced and the supply curve shifts upwards. The consumer pays a higher price, but the producer receives the same price for his particular output. Hence, effectively, the consumer pays the whole of this particular tax. All the tax revenue comes from the consumer. The supplier is unaffected. Note also that the quantity traded is unaffected. The other extreme situation is where we have a perfectly elastic demand curve, horizontal demand curve. Again, we have a situation where a tax is imposed and that shifts the supply curve upwards. But consumers in this situation are unwilling to pay any higher price. So in this situation, the price remains unchanged and the quantity traded contracts to give a new equilibrium. The consumer pays the same. It is the producer who actually receives less. And hence it is effectively the producer who pays all the tax. But note also that quantity traded has actually gone down quite considerably. So the tax revenue that the government could expect from imposing a tax on this market is less than it could expect by imposing a tax on our alternative market with the perfectly inelastic demand curve. Now, in reality, it is therefore normally goods which are assumed to have very inelastic demand that are taxed the most extensively. For example, cigarettes and alcohol. The reasoning is that very inelastic demand means that there's little effect, if any, on quantity traded, and it is only the revenue to the government which is paid by the consumer.